Guys, we have more than 1,300 people missing after this catastrophic event. I don't even want to say landslide. We have to say glacier collapse, mountain collapse, flash flood, landslide, like clogged lake collapse, this earthquake. This is crazy what happened. Catastrophic flooding, let's call it that way, has destroyed critical infrastructure, is hampering rescue efforts, including the search of over 300 foreigners. There were many tourists in the area, and I'm showing you the latest videos here. 1,300 people. We know with events like this, many of them, unfortunately, will change to a side that is very, very sad, right? We have now confirmed over 165 people are lost. And I think from the ones missing, unfortunately, the number on the other side will increase. We have the rescue operations that are still ongoing. Crushing floodwaters, new dramatic footage shows a torrent of water hitting this mountainous region. So that's why I want to show you this. So have a little patience, watch these videos. You haven't seen them before, I promise you, and I'll give you the latest update. And now we know where this was coming from, but there's still a mystery because they thought that much water must come from the debris, was clogging a river, and then the water was getting stored behind, and then there was a sudden collapse. But we have satellite images from before and after. There is no lake. Where did the water come from? I'm going to clear that for you in this video. About that mountain collapse, earthquake, landslide, a magnitude 5.2 landslide. That is now the correct description in Nepal at the Tibet-China border. Affected people in China also. And this is really crazy. We have just new images. That's why I'm doing this update. What is happening there, guys? You have to see this. This is really crazy and sad at the same time. A magnitude 5.2 landslide. This is a follow-up. The crazy images that we're getting, they keep coming in. This is much bigger than I realized yesterday when I released the first video, because the earthquake that appeared to happen immediately before the catastrophic collapse, mountain collapse in Nepal, wasn't an earthquake. USGS has now gone back through the seismic data and says no earthquake occurred. What those instruments recorded was the mountain collapsing. The mountain was causing a magnitude 5.2 earthquake, like a seismic event equivalent to the magnitude 5.2. And I mean, think about this for a moment when you see these images. We all remember Blatten. This is basically a mass of ice. There was a glacier involved and rock that came off this mountain with enough force that seismic stations initially interpreted the signal as an earthquake. But there's an even bigger question. What exactly collapsed? You have asked this in the comments of my first video. So was there really a glacier involved, and where did it come from? And perhaps most importantly, what we have to say, if there was no extreme rainfall, there wasn't, it was a sunny day, and scientists are not seeing an enormous glacial lake sitting upstream, where did enough water come from to create that gigantic wall of swallowed buildings like a 100-feet tsunami? Because new satellite imagery is finally beginning to show us where this catastrophe started, and there's still one part of this sequence that scientists haven't completely resolved. I've worked in geology for 18 years, analyzing, drilling across the world, and I know that this is one of the events where the interpretation can change dramatically once better seismic data and satellite data become available. Because yesterday, the sequence appeared straightforward. Magnitude 4.4 earthquake was reported near the Nepal-China border. Then the mountain collapsed. Then that huge debris and flash flood arrived. That raised the possibility that the earthquake destabilized the slope or the mountain. That explanation is now essentially gone. USGS reanalyzed nearby seismic station, long period seismic waves, and satellite imagery concluded that the signal wasn't coming from tectonic rupture underground. I'm showing you the image here of historic seismic earthquakes, so that was not too far off. But here, the landslide has produced the earthquake. So it was upgraded from 4.4 to 5.2. So instead of earthquake and then collapse, we appear to have had collapse, and the collapse itself shook the ground. And guys, that is an enormous event. I mean, magnitude 5.2, that's a lot of energy. Now the scientists have begun locating where that collapsing material actually came from. And now they know there's more. I mean, satellite imagery has analyzed Nepal's landscape, and northeast of the Rasuwagadhi Nepal-China border, crossing roughly 20 kilometers, 12 miles from that border crossing. This is high Himalayan terrain above the drainage that is feeding the Lhende Khola, which then flows towards the Bhote Koshi and eventually into the Trishuli River. Lots of rivers there. So the preliminary image shows an enormous ice and rock avalanche, and this is where the glacier question gets interesting. There is an interview out with Professor Rian Bhakta Kayashta, who heads the Department of Environmental Science at the Kathmandu University, and his assessment was that this was primarily caused by a, how he calls it, huge ice avalanche from a nearby glacier. So he described that glacier as being on the Nepal side of this border region within the wider Langtang area. Other preliminary satellite descriptions place the collapse right along the Nepal-China border. So the precise political side of the source area is still being refined. And guys, don't send me these comments that you sent me in my last video that I'm a Chinese agent or something like this. I'm reporting about this natural disaster. That's it. But what I want to say about the disaster, I have not yet seen a reliable scientific source assign a confirmed name to the exact glacier that has failed here. So when you see people online already naming a specific glacier with complete certainty, be careful about that. What we can say with much more confidence is that glacial ice was involved. We have reports that satellite analysis indicates a significant section of glacier at roughly 5,200 meters elevation, around 17,000 feet, broke loose and fell more than 1,200 meters, nearly 4,000 feet into the valley below. And that vertical drop is extraordinary, we have to say. I mean, imagine an enormous mixture of ice and mountain rock accelerating down almost 4,000 vertical feet. We've all seen Blatten in Switzerland, but this is even more where this has accelerated. So it doesn't simply land at the bottom and stop like it did in Switzerland, burying the village of Blatten. It fragments. This is what happened here. It pulverizes rock. It entrains loose sediment. It drives air outwards. That's why we have these unbelievable images. And once that moving mass enters a confined river valley, it can begin picking up water and additional debris as it moves. Now, we get to the part right now that I think is most important about this disaster. Because if we're just simply saying a glacier collapsed, that still doesn't explain that enormous amount of flood. And I also want to say, in the videos that you see behind me, people are filming with their cell phones. I mean, some are very smart. They're screaming for the others, get away, get away. But still, some people are standing where they are way too long. I mean, they're filming, yes, that's why we have these videos, but gosh, and I'm showing you a video at the end. It's a little bit of a longer video, but one had his cell phone on while he was running for his life away from the flood, and you see how close he got to that. It's absolutely frightening because we're running with him when we're watching that video. But again, simply saying a glacier collapsed still doesn't explain that enormous flood. Where did all the water come from? That is the big question. And Professor Kayasha has pointed out something visible in the glacier itself. It's called crevasses. I hope I pronounced this right. That is basically when we have a heavily fractured glacier that can contain meltwater at the surface, inside fractures, and also potentially beneath the ice. So if we have the phenomenon that water is entering those cracks, it can move through the glacier and it basically can accumulate in hidden drainage pathways. Why is that so crucial? If a large section suddenly fails, that water that is in there can be released together with ice, rock, and sediment. But that may only be part of what happened here. Also, only be part. This avalanche here, landslide, flash flood, appears to have entered the Lhende River. And what happens when an ice rock avalanche enters a narrow river valley like here? The debris can temporarily block the river. The water keeps arriving, but now it has nowhere to go. So we're not talking about a pre-existing lake that was sending this down or a dam or anything. This was a temporary natural dam that has formed, and then the water was beginning to pool behind it, and it seems nobody noticed. So eventually, two scenarios: either water overtops the debris or the debris dam fails at once, and this is what happened here. So suddenly everything that is stored behind it is released, and that's the working explanation that right now Nepalese hydrologists are now investigating. And satellite information obtained through Chinese authorities reportedly showed a blockage roughly 20 kilometers upstream of the Meteri Bridge, where debris may have created a temporary lake before it failed. But now comes the part where I have to say this is really weird. It is weird. Professor Kayasha has told the news stations that when researchers looked at Planet Labs imagery, they could clearly see the enormous ice and rock avalanche, but they did not see a huge lake or like enormous blockage sitting there afterwards. So we're back to clue number one, or loop number one. Where did the water come from? So that doesn't necessarily mean a temporary lake never existed. These debris dams can form and fail extremely quickly. So a satellite might see the valley before the blockage forms, and then again after the majority of it has already breached. So investigators may effectively be trying to reconstruct something that existed only briefly, very briefly. That is still a mystery, I have to say that. And briefly is so important because like downstream measurements that we have tell us that an enormous amount of material and water was released. So why at once? So this storage lake must have been massive.
Video shared on social media shows
at
people running
Galchi,
and riding
the
away on
Trishuli
motorbikes,
River
realizing
reportedly
how
rose
little
as by
time
as
they
much
have
as
to get
9
to
meters,
safety.
guys. That's
At
30
this
feet
Himalayan
in
border
approximately
crossing, people
30
on the
minutes.
street
So
could
that
probably
is
hear the danger
absolutely
coming
not
before
a
they could
normal
see
river
it.
rise.
A
That
recently
was a
rebuilt,
floodway.
earthquake-resistant building
So if they
blocked
didn't
their
find
view
that
of the monster
lake,
wall of water
it's still,
until
this is
it was too
impressive.
late. From this view,
Other
you can see the
meteorologists
floodwater's
described the event
ferocious
almost like an
speed and
inland
massive
tsunami.
scale.
And yes,
People
this is what it
desperately running
looks
for
like,
their
a
lives
high
have
energy
nowhere
surge
safe to go.
being
In what
squeezed
appears to
through
be
these
about
narrow
20 seconds
Himalayan
on video,
valleys. And
the flood
you can see
consumes
exactly
everything in its
what
path.
that confinement
A row of
does in
buses,
the
a
videos. These
four-story
narrow,
building,
steep
a bridge,
valleys.
gone,
There is
buried
no
beneath
space
a
for the
black
water
wall
to
of
spread
water.
sideways.
From the air,
It
a
goes
helicopter pilot
where it
watches
can.
the disaster
So
race through
the
the valleys
valley
below,
walls force
sweeping
the
away
mass
homes, trees,
downstream,
and roads.
unfortunately.
The whole
And
scenario,
since the
it
valley is so
was
steep,
horrendous.
this
It
is
was
where the people
uncanny,
settle, where it's
anything
not
like
steep.
you've ever
So
seen before.
the
On
energy
this bus in
remains
Nepal,
concentrated,
passengers spot the
and
giant
also
waves
this was not
crashing
clean
into the
flood
bridge
water. It
behind
was
them.
carrying rock, sediment, mud, pieces of ice, trees,
The streets
and
are full
debris.
of people
So
trying to
load
get
it,
away.
changes
Panic
the
fills the
physics
bus as passengers look
completely
out the
of
windows
what's
at the
coming
horror
down, hitting the
unfolding.
village, and that's why the village was buried so aggressively,
In the
right?
same
Because
town,
water
from the
alone,
safety
it
of a
flows
hillside
through
temple,
structures.
people
A debris-laden
watch
surge
helplessly
can
as
hit
the
them almost
deluge of dark
like
water breaks
moving
apart the
concrete,
bridge
and
like
this
a
is
toy,
what this looks
dragging
like,
it
right? This is
downstream.
why trucks disappeared
This video from the
underneath
Nepal
that,
Red
that
Cross
landslide
captures the
debris.
speed and strength
This is
of
why
the
entire
water,
lower
whipping
floors
around
were
cars and
buried
tearing
even
down
up to the
power
second and
lines in
third
its path.
floor. And this is
The
why
flood
some
came
of these
crashing
buildings
down
were
from
hit by material that looks less like a river and more like the side of a mountain moving horizontally through the valley. This is what this was. This is a good description, right? I think. That's why I'm telling you this. But remember what makes this event especially disturbing. There was no heavy rainfall event over the source area that would be capable of explaining this. Usually we see landslides after monsoon rainfalls and stuff like this. People downstream weren't watching a violent thunderstorm approaching. The danger originated high in the mountains, miles away. They had no idea. By the time the river itself revealed what had happened, the flood wave was already traveling towards them. So now there's another detail from another news interview that I want to be careful with, but I want to tell it to you because that information may be changing by the hour. Professor Kayasha said that several hours before his interview, contacts on the Chinese side had told him there was still approximately 7 meters, that's around 23 feet, of water associated with an upstream blockage. So we could have another run. So that was a report he received through contacts, not a current instrument reading that can independently be verified right now. So let's be careful with that, but it explains why authorities remained concerned about additional releases of water. Because if we're dealing with an event that is so large, guys, the upstream valley does not instantly become like stable again, right? There can be additional debris dams. And also pieces of ice can continue to collapse as well. So loose rock that's in the area can move. And of course, other channels can become blocked in places that also, again, nobody downstream can see. So I hope that they're surveilling that area right now. So for the people that are down there trying to rescue people, the danger isn't necessarily finished when the first flood wave passes. And now that the USGS has effectively removed the earthquake from the sequence, the scientists have to focus much more closely on why the glacier and the mountain slope failed on their own without rain. I mean, of course, high temperatures are one possibility being investigated. Also, Professor Kayashta specifically discussed very warm conditions and increased ice melt in the region that can lubricate a mountain, a glacier, everything. Like when meltwater enters the crevasses and weakens parts of a glacier, then it can lubricate the bed that's underneath. And but high temperatures, warming can also destabilize rock that's frozen that is surrounding these high altitude glaciers, right? But please be careful. There's an important distinction here. Also here, the scientists have not yet demonstrated the precise trigger for this individual collapse. So it would be premature to say something like climate change definitely caused this particular disaster. But what can be said is that the Himalayas are warming rapidly, the glaciers are thinning, and they're retreating. We know that. Scientists are increasingly concerned about cascading hazards that are involving ice, rock, and water. And this river system has already given them a warning last year when the Lhende Khola flooded catastrophically last year. Maybe that saved lives this year because people were aware something's coming when they heard it rumble. The previous event was associated with a glacial flood in the same general drainage. And now only 14 months later, another extreme, we have to say that event has come down essentially the same river system. But this time the mechanism appears different. So this wasn't simply a lake slowly filling until it burst. It was not the case, not a dam. Evidence we have right now points towards an enormous physical collapse of glacier, ice, and rock beginning high above the river. So that collapsing mass has generated the seismic waves.